we welcome you, our Mets Hot Stove, first of the season, fellas, presented by Geico. Gary Apple, the former Mets general manager. Jim Duquette is here. Anthony DiComo, the Mets beat writer for MLB.com. And again, I feel like we were just here, and in many ways we were, with the Mets making it to the World Series. I think it's fair to say that this is the Mets' most important offseason in many years, with a championship caliber team that is certainly facing some changes. So let's begin with changes and expectations and the plan for this offseason. Jim, I'll begin with you. How do you see things shaking out?
Well, first up, I think that we're going to see the payroll about the same where we saw it at the end of the season, maybe right around that 110 million range. And so, really, if your expectation is how do you compare to the World Series team, it's going to be a little different starting next year. I think really the starting point for the Mets in the front office is opening day from last year to this year. I don't think they're going to be able to match a Cespedes type of deal, that type of arrangement. The good news is there's plenty of position players out there in the free agent market to fill the needs, whether it's short or second, whether it's center field or one of the outfield positions. So I think that's the good news. And I think also there's a couple of trade chips that are out there and available too. So I think they can fill their needs, the position player needs, without having to go with what they already have currently.
What we know for sure is that there are going to be changes. Just how many we don't know, but how do you assess it, Anthony?
Well, Gary, I think it's a difficult offseason for the Mets because they are going to be facing a situation where they have very specific needs. So while there are a lot of players out there who could help them, there are a lot of free agents that could help them. Things that they need, like a left-handed center fielder, for example, the guys at the end of the bullpen, a versatile middle infielder, are not going to be the easiest to come by. So they're going to have to get creative, I think. I think the Mets are going to look at a lot of different trades, talk to a lot of different teams, and we'll see where they go from there.
Let's look at starting pitching and which potentially starting pitchers the Mets would think about moving this offseason.
Well, I think I got to go with Zach Wheeler, number one on that list.
And we've heard that name quite a bit.
And that's a big reason why. He's not going to be back until probably July, maybe August. You never know. While the Mets love his upside and the Mets love what Zach Wheeler can do for you in the future, you don't know what this guy's going to be this year. He's not going to be a force, obviously, in the first half of the season. But as we learned in July, he still has a lot of value. He could get you something. And when you have these specific needs that I'm talking about, and you need to find creative ways to fill it, that's certainly one way.
Yeah, and Wheeler, there's a lot of smoke around Wheeler. And I think that's the interesting thing is there's a good chance that he could be moved. Jay Bruce, that whole deal, when you look at him, you're willing to give up Wheeler for a year and a half of Jay Bruce. But whether it's a year or now of Jay Bruce, because he's a free agent at the end of the year, you kind of sit there and go, I don't know if I would do that. And teams that might be willing to trade for Wheeler, like let's say like the Cardinals need starting pitching, they need him in April, and so and that's the thing is if he was available in April, the Mets probably wouldn't move him. So it's kind of a tricky thing when you look at Wheeler. So I think you have to look at some of the other starters. Are any other starters available? I don't think any of the top three are going to be. It would be very unusual for me to think that any of those top three guys, when I say that, certainly Harvey's name has been mentioned a lot. I don't think Harvey's going anywhere. The guy that you look at, you say, maybe Steven Matz, but I think that Matz is valued a little bit higher by the Mets than the industry right now. You haven't seen an awful lot of Matz at the major league level yet.
Yeah, I agree with you fully. I think that's one guy that they could trade. I think that's one guy who will certainly come up in talks, but you got to look at him as an injury-prone guy. He has been. Maybe it's not fair going forward, but that's what he's been in his career. I think the Mets know that. I think other teams know that, and it's going to be difficult to trade a guy like Steven Matz at the peak of his value.
And then there's a guy by the name of Daniel Murphy, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Murph. Probably not going to be back with the Mets next season. Carried through the Mets, certainly in the division series against the Dodgers, National League Championship Series against the Cubs. He declined the team's $15.8 million qualifying offer on Friday. He's now set to test the free agent market. And while the Mets could still sign Murph, he would seem to be more of a fit with an American League team. He could potentially be a DH part of the time. There is no denying Murphy's offensive prowess. From the time he came up, 2008, through this past season, second on the team in games played, hits, doubles, RBIs, and runs by only the captain, David Wright. So what about free agent options to replace Daniel Murphy? I'll begin with you on that, Anthony.
Well, I'm not sure it's a matter of replacing Daniel Murphy, and the reason why I say that is the Mets are not going to go out and just get an everyday second baseman. It's not what they're looking for. They're looking for someone more versatile, someone who can play many different positions, because you have Dilson Herrera, who they like. You have potentially Wilmer Flores, who you can slide over to second base if you get a shortstop. So I think the Mets love a guy like Ben Zobrist, for example, who can play different positions. I was asking, actually, someone in the front office today what he thought about Ben Zobrist. And the reason why they like that guy and why they've been linked to him in the past and why they think he could be a fit is not because he plays second base, he does, but he plays the corner outfield too, and that solves some issues for you when you don't know what you're going to get with Mike Kadire. You just don't know what the total situation is out there. So if you can get a guy who you can play a lot of days at second base while you figure out what you have with Dilson Herrera, I think that does wonders for them.
The other guy that I think that, and if you look at it from the Mets' perspective, they could look at, and they could fill the shortstop position, always move Flores over to second base, is a guy like Ian Desmond. Now, they look at Alexi Ramirez. I don't think he's really on their radar. Asdrubal Cabrera is a guy that they've liked, and I wouldn't rule him out, too. But Desmond, for me, is an interesting guy because they tried to trade for him a couple years ago. You remember with Murphy Plus. Now, I don't think, his value certainly took a hit this past year, 2015. Defense went backwards. The offense went backwards, but he's still only 30 years old. There's not a lot of teams out there that have needs for a shortstop. You look at it, the White Sox, the Padres, they're probably not going to be in on the bidding. Tampa Bay, probably not either. So the Mets, I think you keep an eye on that. He's certainly not going to get $75 to $90 million. I think a reasonable contract for a guy like Desmond would be a 4-year type of deal for $60 million. Now, you spread it out a little bit this year at $12 million, the other 3 at $15. He'd have maybe even have a club option for $15 million with a $3 million buyout. The total nut would be 4 years at $60 million. That's not unreasonable for him. He reminds me a lot of Curtis Granderson when the Mets were there a couple years ago. He's that type of cachet when it comes to people, leader in the clubhouse, leader off the field, talented player coming off of a down year. If he was healthy, he'd be making $90, $100 million. So I think that's a guy that the Mets should at least keep an eye on.
And he did turn down, if I'm not mistaken, a deal for about 100 plus in Washington.
Yeah, the question to me with Ian Desmond is this guy going to produce for you? I think with Granderson, that's an interesting comparison because he was a guy who was already in his 30s when the Mets got him. There was a little bit of question about whether he would be productive, but I think there was a lot of confidence there too. Desmond, is he at the end of his arc here, of his career arc? Is he going to continue to be productive? And if not, those are innings you're taking away from Wilmer Flores, from Dilson Herrera. The middle infield positions are all sort of interconnected. So are you willing to take a gamble not only in money, but in playing time for these other guys who could still improve?
And you mentioned middle infield, the possibility that they do remain pat. When you think about Tejada, is he going to come back? Will he be healthy? Flores, will he play shortstop? Will he play second base? You mentioned Herrera. We know about Reynolds. He's in the mix as well. What are the chances the Mets stay pat up the middle?
Look, it wouldn't shock me. We've heard, how many times have we heard over the years that the Mets are going to trade Wilmer Flores or do something at that shortstop position, right? And they haven't done it yet. And I think they've been satisfied with Wilmer's production. I think there is still room for growth there. And I think the Mets realize that, we can allocate this payroll elsewhere. If we're not going to go out and get Ian Desmond, we can allocate this in other areas and hope that Wilmer improves. And if not, you could easily see something like what the Mets did this July and make the trade then.
At the trade deadline.
Sure.
At the deadline. And you know what? I think if they were to do that, if they went status quo in the middle infield, they'd have to pump a lot of money into an upgrade on the, let's say, the offensive front in the outfield. Like a guy like Cespedes, is there a chance of him coming back? Well, the money wouldn't be $140 million, but if it was back around $90 to $100 million, and maybe that's how they spend their money, then they might go a little less expensive up the middle. But I think the best way for them to upgrade their entire team is to find a guy in the middle infield and in the outfield. So we'll see.
By the way, you can get more on the Mets middle infield position on Mets blog online.